I was kicked out of my home because my job wasn't prestigious enough. Now, years later, my parents are standing at my doorstep, broke and desperate, asking for my help. I should have slammed the door in their faces. But I didn't. The night they kicked me out is burned into my memory. I was 19, standing in the driveway with a duffel bag in one hand and a trash bag full of clothes in the other. The porch light flickered above me, casting my dad's shadow long and sharp across the pavement. His voice was cold. Final. If you're too damn stubborn to listen, then go. But don't come crawling back when life slaps you in the face. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't say a word. Didn't even look at me. It had started as another fight, one of the many we'd had since I told them I wasn't going to college. I didn't want to be a lawyer like my dad or chase some high-paying corporate job. I wanted to work with my hands, build something real. I had been working for a moving company part-time since high school, and I liked it. Lifting furniture, organizing spaces, seeing the tangible results of my work at the end of the day. It made sense to me in a way that sitting in a lecture hall never did. But to my parents, that wasn't a real career. You want to waste your life hauling other people's junk? My dad had spat earlier that night, voice laced with disgust. Fine, but not under my roof. I still remember the way my stomach twisted. The cold, sinking realization that he meant it. I thought Mom might step in, tell him he was being too harsh. She didn't. So I left. The first few months were hell. I slept in my truck, showered at the gym when I could, and ate whatever I could afford. Usually dollar menu burgers or gas station sandwiches. Some nights, I went to bed hungry, my stomach growling as I lay curled up in the cramped back seat. I kept working, picking up extra shifts, saving every dollar I could. And little by little, things started to change. I bought my own moving truck. Then another. I hired guys who were like me, hard workers who just needed a chance. And before I knew it, I wasn't just some broke kid hauling couches. I was running a business. By the time I was 24, I had a full crew, 10 trucks, and more clients than I could handle. I had made it. Without them. Which is why, when my sister Jenny called me out of the blue, I almost didn't answer. I stared at my phone screen for a long time, her name glowing against the dark background. Jenny, Mom's phone, calling. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Finally, I swiped to accept. Yeah. My voice came out rougher than I intended. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Ethan, they lost everything. My grip on the phone tightened. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed. Come again. She exhaled shakily. Dad got laid off months ago. The law firm pushed him out, and he hasn't been able to find another job. Mom's sick. And now, they lost the house. I stared at the wall, my mind struggling to catch up. The house. The one I had grown up in. The one they had thrown me out of. Gone. Jenny's voice was small, hesitant. They have nowhere to go, Ethan. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat. That's ironic, don't you think? Silence. Then, softer, I know. But they're still our parents. I clenched my jaw. I wanted to tell her it wasn't my problem, that they had made their choice. But the truth was, no matter how much I wanted to hate them, I couldn't. I let out a slow breath. Where are they now? At a motel, she said. But they can't stay there much longer. I squeezed my eyes shut. I already knew what I was going to do, and I hated myself for it. The motel was the kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. The neon sign buzzed faintly, half the letters burned out. A couple of guys sat on the curb near the entrance, passing a cigarette back and forth. I pulled into the lot and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the number Jenny had texted me. Room 217. It felt surreal. Like I had stepped into some alternate reality where my father, Michael Reynolds, the man who once told me I'd never make anything of myself, was now the one with nothing. I took a breath, then climbed out of the truck. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and stale beer. A TV droned from one of the rooms, muffled voices bleeding through the paper-thin walls. I knocked twice. There was shuffling inside. A moment later, the door cracked open, and there he was. My father. For a second, we just stared at each other. He looked different. Smaller. The broad-shouldered, sharp-dressed man I had grown up with was gone. His hair was grayer than I remembered, his face drawn, his shirt wrinkled like he had slept in it. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel anything at all. Ethan, he said finally, his voice rough. I nodded once. Can I come in? He hesitated, then stepped aside. The motel room was small and bare. A single bed, An old TV, a rickety nightstand with a styrofoam cup half filled with cold coffee. My mother sat on the bed, her hands wrapped around a tissue, twisting it between her fingers. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Ethan." I ignored the lump in my throat. "Jenny said you lost the house." Dad shut the door behind me. "Yeah. How?" My voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "You always told me being a lawyer was the only path to success. That people like me, people who lift couches for a living, would never make it." "So what happened, Dad?" His jaw tightened. Mom wiped at her eyes. "Ethan, please. We made mistakes. But we're in trouble. We don't have anywhere else to go." I looked around the room again. The suitcase by the door. The takeout containers stacked on the nightstand. They really had nothing. And despite everything, despite the way they had treated me, the part of me that had spent years fighting to prove myself, the part that had slept in the back of a truck, starving and alone, couldn't just walk away. I let out a slow breath. "You need a job?" Dad swallowed hard. "Yes." A bitter smile tugged at my lips. "Fine. You can come work for me." His brows pulled together. "For you." I folded my arms. "Yeah. At the company I built after you threw me out." He didn't argue. Didn't scoff. He just nodded. Dad showed up to the warehouse the next morning at 6:45 a.m. 15 minutes early. I spotted him standing near the employee entrance, hands shoved into the pockets of a pair of old jeans. His posture was stiff, like he wasn't sure where to go or what to do with himself. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits, not that he had many left, I guessed. Instead, he had on a faded t-shirt and work boots that looked barely worn. I parked my truck and stepped out. He straightened slightly when he saw me, but I didn't acknowledge him right away. Just nodded toward the loading dock. "Follow me." Inside, the warehouse was already alive with movement. My guys were loading up the trucks, shouting back and forth, checking schedules. Luis, my foreman, was barking orders near the dispatch desk, clipboard in hand. The smell of coffee and sweat filled the air. Dad followed me through the maze of stacked furniture and moving blankets, his gaze flicking around the place like he was trying to take it all in. "This is your company?" he finally asked. I didn't look at him. "Yeah." He exhaled quietly. I didn't realize it was this big. Something about the way he said it made my jaw tighten. "What? You thought I was still working out of the back of my truck?" He didn't answer. I stopped near one of the trucks where Luis was triple-checking a delivery list. He glanced up, then flicked his eyes toward Dad. "This the new guy?" I nodded. "His name's Mike." Luis gave him a once-over, then handed him a pair of work gloves. "You ever done a moving job before, Mike?" Dad hesitated. "No, but—" "Doesn't matter," Luis cut in. "You'll learn fast. Just follow my lead." Dad took the gloves without a word. Luis turned back to me. "We good?" I nodded again. He clapped my father on the shoulder. "All right, rookie. Let's go." I watched them head toward one of the trucks, then exhaled slowly. I should have felt something. Satisfaction. Vindication. Instead, I just felt tired. For the first few weeks, Dad barely spoke to me. I'd see him around the warehouse, lifting boxes, loading furniture, following orders. He kept his head down, worked hard, never complained. But I noticed things. How his back ached by the end of the day. How he rubbed his hands after gripping heavy furniture for too long. How he struggled to keep up with guys half his age. I should have felt bad for him. But then I'd remember the nights I spent sleeping in my truck. The meals I skipped because I couldn't afford food. The way he looked at me the night he threw me out, like I was nothing. And whatever sympathy I had would disappear. One evening, I was finishing up paperwork in my office when there was a knock on the door. I glanced up. Yeah. The door creaked open, and Dad stepped inside. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he cleared his throat. "Can I sit?" I gestured to the chair across from me. He lowered himself into it, rubbing his hands together. They were rough now, calloused. He hesitated. "I just wanted to say, I respect what you've built here." I leaned back in my chair. "That's so?" He nodded. "Yeah, I was wrong about you." The words hung in the air between us. I should have felt relieved, or validated. But all I felt was hollow. I studied him for a long moment. "Why'd you do it?" He frowned. "Do what?" "Throw me out." My voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Why did you do it, Dad?" He exhaled slowly, staring down at his hands. "I was proud," he admitted. "I thought I knew what was best for you. I thought if I pushed hard enough, you'd cave. That you'd get a degree, get a real job, make something of yourself." He looked up, meeting my eyes. I didn't realize you already were. Something twisted in my chest. I didn't know if I could forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time in my life, my father wasn't looking down on me. And that was something. And for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes I never thought I'd see. Humility. I didn't say anything right away. I just sat there, watching him shift uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his calloused hands together like he wasn't sure what to do with them. The words hung in the air between us. I didn't realize you already were. A few years ago, I would have given anything to hear that. Now it just felt late. Too late. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair. Is that all? His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he was going to argue, fall back into his old ways, try to justify everything. But he just nodded. Yeah. I nodded too, then glanced at the clock on the wall. You should get some sleep. Early shift tomorrow. He got the message. He pushed himself up from the chair, wincing slightly as he straightened his back. He hesitated at the door, like he wanted to say something else, but in the end, he just nodded again and left. I stared at the empty space where he had been for a long time. The next few weeks, Dad kept his head down and worked. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, but I saw the way the job was wearing him down. He was slower than the other guys, had trouble keeping up. Luis told me once, "Your old man's got grit, I'll give him that. But he's not built for this." I knew Luis was right, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Dad broke himself trying to prove something. So one afternoon, I called him into my office again. He came in looking wary, like he thought I was about to fire him. I gestured to the chair. Sit. He did. I studied him for a moment. His hands, now rough from weeks of lifting. His face, lined with exhaustion. This isn't working, I said. He stiffened. I can handle it. No, you can't. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. You ever worked an office job? He frowned. Of course. Good, I said. Because starting Monday, you're moving to logistics. You'll be coordinating jobs, managing schedules, handling client calls. He blinked, caught off guard. You want me in the office? I want you where you won't drop dead trying to lift a dresser. He exhaled sharply, looking down at his hands. He flexed them once, then nodded. All right, he said. A week later, I found myself at Jenny's apartment for dinner. Mom had been staying with her since the motel, and she had been asking to see me. I told myself I was just going for Jenny's sake. But when I stepped inside and saw Mom sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, something in my chest tightened. She looked up and smiled, though there was something uncertain about it. Oh, Ethan, she whispered. I gave her a small nod. Hey, Mom. Her eyes filled with tears. Thank you for coming. I sat across from her. Jenny said you wanted to talk. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. She took a shaky breath. I should have stopped him that night. I swallowed hard. Yeah, you should have. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I was weak. I let him decide everything. I told myself it was for the best, but it wasn't. I failed you. I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, she didn't look like my mother. She looked like a person. Flawed. Human. I exhaled. Yeah, Mom. You did. She nodded, voice thick. But I'm here now. I sat back in my chair, studying her. Then, slowly, I nodded too. Yeah, I said quietly. You are. I didn't stay long. After a while, the conversation slowed, and the weight of everything, the past, the years lost, settled between us. Mom looked like she wanted to say more, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. So I pushed my chair back and stood. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, she just gave me a small, sad smile and said, "Come back sometime, okay?" I nodded once. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And then I left. A few more months passed. Dad settled into his new role. He wasn't perfect. He had his old habits, his pride, but he did the job well. And for the first time, he seemed to respect what I had built. One evening, I was locking up the warehouse when I spotted him outside, sitting on the loading dock. He was watching the sky, his posture tired but lighter, somehow. I almost kept walking, but something made me stop. I walked over, leaned against the railing. Long day. He huffed a quiet laugh. Every day's a long day. Silence stretched between us. Then, after a moment, he cleared his throat. You know, Ethan, I've been thinking a lot about that night. I didn't move. He let out a slow breath. I was wrong. Not just about your career, but about everything. His voice was steady, quieter than I remembered. I let my pride decide what was best for you. And I lost my son because of it. I swallowed hard. He turned his head, met my eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I'm proud of you. For a second, I couldn't breathe. All my life, I had wanted to hear those words. And now that I had, I didn't know what to do with them. I exhaled slowly, staring out at the horizon. The sky was streaked with deep orange and fading blue. Then, finally, I nodded. That's good to know. Dad smiled. Just a little. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd be okay.